Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Last season we did a project called the Library System, a combination of bookcases and closed storage. We were amazed at how many of you wrote in for the plans. We have another one for you this year. We call it the Greek Revival Bookcase. That's next, right here in the new Yankee Workshop. One of the problems with open bookcases is that the bookcases get dusty. Charles Spada, who designed this library, solved that problem by calling for these glass front bookcases. You can still see the books, but they're dust-free. And I like the way that these cabinets were built. They actually took two pieces of 3/4-inch plywood, sandwiched them together, and then to cover the edge grain, applied a solid wood face frame. And when it's all put together, you can't even see any of the joints. The doors have concealed hinges, and down here at the base, they actually took the base of the room and continued it around the bookcase, so it unifies everything. At the front of the room, there are open bookcases, floor to ceiling. And here you really see how solid they are, very rugged, 1.5 inches thick, with a nicely joined face frame. The shelves are adjustable, and for the adjustable shelf pins, they use the European spacing system, which calls for smaller holes, making them less noticeable. Up at the ceiling, a crown molding was used, which matches the one that goes around the room, tying it all together. So I think if we go back to the workshop, pick up some sheets of plywood and some poplar, we can come up with our own version of the Greek Revival Library. The more I studied that library, the more I realized it was about good design. I liked the height of those glass front cabinets. Along the long wall, there were pairs of doors separated by a narrow stile. When it turned the corner, they had a need for a 3-door unit, and 3 is good. And if you look at this piece, there's a nice proportion between the width and the height. Now the trick with 3 doors is how do you hang this center door? What they did is they put a partition and another stile, and that's a compromise because your eye goes right to that, and so it disrupts the flow. So I thought that if I could find a way to eliminate that style, I would have a more elegant piece. So here's what I did. Single door on the left, and these doors actually pivot on a bifold hinge. That eliminates the stile, which means when it's closed, it has a very elegant look. Now over here on the tall case, I made a slight modification to the cornice molding. I did some research on the internet and I found an example very similar to this. A nice big sweeping cove, which I got at my mill workshop, capped off by a piece of standard 1x material. Now here you really see the elegance of these Greek Revival bookcases. By using the double plywood, everything appears to be slab-like. Think of it as marble. And once this piece is all painted white, it's going to look great. Now if you'd like to build your own Greek Revival bookcase, a measure drawing will be available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, follow, and understand all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now the main ingredient in these bookcases is plywood, 3/4-inch thick, and I'm told by the manufacturer that the skin is either maple or birch, and it's pre-primed, so that's going to save us some time in the finishing room. First job is to rip all my pieces. Now for cross-cutting, we have an advantage here at the workshop. We happen to have a radial arm saw. If you don't have that, you can easily cut them with a straight edge and a circular saw. For wide cross cuts, I like to use a straight edge and the spacer. The spacer goes up against the straight edge and then I bring it to my layout line. Now the width of the spacer is equal to the distance between the edge of my circular saw and the blade. Let's take a look at the shelf support system. Now at first glance it appears that these shelves are fixed, but they actually float on these pins. Now you might also note that the holes for the pins are smaller than what we usually use. Usually we have 1/4-inch diameter holes. These are 5 millimeter to receive these pins which have smaller ends. The spacing between the pins is about 1.25 inches or 32 millimeter. This spacing comes from the European system of cabinet making. What it does for them is it gives consistency between shop to shop and job to job. Also, by having unified spacing, they can use these holes for pins, to attach hinges, and even drawer slides. Let me show you how I drill the holes. It starts with a jig, a very simple one, made out of plexiglass, and it has a series of large holes that are 32 millimeters on center. There is a fence, and depending which side of the clear piece I set the fence on determines the distance of the holes from the edge of the plywood. Here I want 37 millimeters. The second part of the system is the bit, very much like a Vicks bit. It has this collar, which centers the bit, and it has a stop, which controls the depth that I'll drill the hole. I start out by putting a line at the center point of my standard. That collar goes right in the large hole, and I drill the first hole. Then I slide the jig forward, take a shelf pin, lock it in place, and now I can drill as many holes as I want. Well, now I'm ready for a little assembly, and I'm applying some glue on the inside of the piece that has the holes drilled for the shelf pins. The outer piece is a little bit taller, so I've put a line down here to locate the bottom edge. There's only enough glue to hold the pieces together. Now I flip it over, and I want to make sure that I keep the front edge absolutely flush all the way down. And if you look over here, you can see that I cut the outer piece a little bit wider, which automatically gives me a rabbet to conceal the back panel. Now with it lined up, I'm going to use some 1.25 inch brads to secure the pieces, using only as many as necessary. Now I'm ready for the bottom of the case. A little bit of glue on those pieces. And I'll set this in, clamp it so it won't move. Put a couple brads in, and then I'm going to secure it permanently with some screws. I like to use these little right angle brackets to hold the pieces square as I assemble them. All right, now I can take the side that I've just assembled, flip it up onto the other standard, and connect it using the same methods. Now I'm ready for the back, which is a piece of 1/2 inch pre-primed plywood. It drops into those rabbets left by the two pieces joined together. Flush at the top, and I'll staple it in place. The back of this case is a very important structural element because it helps keep the case square, and it keeps these sides from bowing out. Here at the bottom of the bookcase, I need to install some backer pieces to help accept the trim later. So first I'm going to put these little cleats, and I want them to be set up so the plywood that I put in front of them will be flush. So I'll just clamp it and then attach it with a couple brads. Now this 6-inch wide piece of plywood gets set right under the bottom shelf, and everything gets nailed in place. Now wherever a nail hole shows, I'll be filling it before we put on any paint. At the top of the case, I'm building a frame out of scrap plywood, and that will help support the top rail of the face frame. Let's take another look at our glass door bookcase. It's made up of double layers of plywood on each side and the top. So there's an inner box with butt joints made up of 4 pieces, and an outer box made up of 3 pieces that have mitered corners so we don't see any end grain. I'll start with the inner box, and I'm going to use glue, brads, and screws to connect the corners. Well, now I'm ready to start the second wrap of plywood that has these mitered corners. And as a general rule, mitered corners like this can be a problem. They want to open up and split. But because we have a box on the inside and we have this nice heavy plywood back with glue and brads, that should stay nice and tight. What I want to do is cut the miter on the side pieces first. So I have pieces that are about 1 inch longer than what I need. I've tipped the saw to 45 degrees, and I have my miter gauge here, which has a nice long fence. I want to make sure that I'm totally in touch with that fence. I want to hold the material tight to the table and slowly guide it through. And then I'll check it for squareness. Well, let's see how we did. Put the square along the long edge and bring it right up to the tip of that miter. And that looks pretty good. Now I'll cut it to length. I do like making the square cuts over here on the radial arm. Okay, now I'm ready to attach the box to those sides that I just mitered. So a little more glue once again. And I want to get it properly positioned. In this case, I want to hold this edge flushed because that's the front. And up here on the end where the miter is, I've actually taken another piece of plywood and mitered it so that I can make sure that I've got it just in the right position before I nail the pieces together. The miter's good, and that's flush. A few 1.25 inch brads. Before I go any further, I want to put the back on. Once again, it's 1/2 inch plywood. I'm going to need 2 pieces because the case is wider and taller than 4 feet. Along the center line of this first piece, I've drilled holes for shelf pins, and that'll help support those long shelves. Once again, I've put glue on the case. I'll drop the piece on and secure it with some staples. Well, this is as far as the 4-foot piece will go, so I'm going to have to add another piece to complete the back. And rather than just have a butt joint with glue, I'm going to cut some slots for biscuits to reinforce it. Now for the top piece. Earlier I mitered one of the ends. Now I have to cut it to length and of course miter the other end. To get the length, I'm simply going to measure it side to side. It's exactly 57.25. I'll mark the piece and cut it just a hair long. I can always trim off a little bit more if I have to. Okay, let's see how it looks. That one's going to fit nicely. Now I come down the other end. And it's just a touch long. See how it's not tight here? So I just want to take a hair off. Otherwise, it's pretty good. A little more glue, and plenty of glue on those 45-degree miters. And I'll secure everything with some more 1.25 inch brads, making sure I hold this front nice and flush. Now, just as I did with the tall case, I'm putting in some fillers along the bottom here, which will help support the trim later. Just made out of scrap plywood. All right. Well, before I leave tonight, I think I'll mill up some stock for the face frames, which we will install tomorrow. We'll also build some doors. I'll show you how to put the base trim on as well as the cornice. We should be able to finish these bookcases with no problem tomorrow. Well, good morning. I'm getting started today covering up the exposed edges on these cases that we built yesterday. For the glass front case, the bottom shelf edge has to be covered because part of that's going to be seen when the doors are open. A little bit of glue and a strip of wood will take care of that. Okay, now on each side, I'm installing a stile, 7/8 inch thick poplar. And you'll note that it's a little bit wider than the thickness of those 2 sheets of plywood. I'll trim that flush with a flush trimming router bit later. Now a piece across the top of the cabinet, a stile for the face frame. Just a butt joint. Because it's backed with solid wood and plenty of glue, it's not going to open up. Now on the bottom of the case, I put another rail, and you'll note that I held it down from the top of this shelf. That'll create a stop for the doors. That rail and these little vertical blocks will provide nailing for the base and the molding when I wrap it. Well, I think that glue has had enough time to set, so at this point I can trim the stiles and rails flush. To do that, I'm using this flush trimming bit. It has a ball bearing which will ride against the plywood, and the bit will trim the wood perfectly flush. The advantage of this technique is that the stile or rail will be perfectly flush with the plywood sandwich, regardless of any variations in the plywood. Now I'll just repeat the process on the inside edge. Now I'm ready for the base. It's 1x6, mitered on the corners, and reinforced with biscuits. The short piece on the side has already been nailed in place. I'm just going to dry fit this corner for the moment to make sure that the miter is good, which is right there. And now I can mark it for length down on the other end. My plate joiner has a fence that I can tip at 45 degrees to cut the slots. All right, some glue on those biscuits and the joint, and I'll fasten it with a few more brads. The final wrap of the base will be this base molding. It's a standard profile that I picked up at my millwork supplier. Now the shelves on our glass door unit are made up of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood sandwiched together and the front edge covered with solid wood. And that'll be plenty strong enough for this long span. Now the doors, all 3 are exactly the same size, made up of 7/8 inch thick stock, rabbeted on the inside to receive the glass, and a stop. The joint at the corner is made up of a groove that's in the stile and a tenon on the rail, and that'll give me plenty of glue surface when I put it together. I want to make these rabbets first. To make the mortises, I've set up a 1/4 inch spiral cutting bit in the router table. I put a mark where I want the mortise to start on the stile, and that'll correspond with marks that I put on my fence. For this first mortise, I can simply push it into the bit. For the one on the other end of the stile, I'll have to drop it on and then finish it off. Now I'm beginning to form the tenons on the rails, and this first cut is on the face of the rail, and it gives us the shoulder. After making a couple of adjustments, I now have cut the shoulder on the inside of the rails, and that's offset slightly so that it'll fit into the rabbet. To make the cheek cuts for the tenons, I'm using my tenoning jig, which holds the piece securely as I run it through the saw. It'll take 2 cuts to complete each tenon. Okay. Now that's what it's supposed to look like. Now I can glue it up. Well, now for the assembly, I put a good coat of glue on all the mating surfaces of both parts, because that's what's going to give that joint a lot of strength. We'll set it together, put it in some clamps, and set it aside to dry. While the doors have been drying, I've been finishing up the open bookcase. I installed a face frame and trimmed it flush with that double layer of plywood, just like I did with the glass front case. I've wrapped the bottom with the baseboard, and now I just have this final piece of molding to put on. Once that's complete, we'll start working on that cornice. Now the first piece of the cornice is this big cove molding. Nice, graceful, sweeping curve. And I thought this would be just the right molding for our piece. Of course, there are a lot of other profiles that you could use. The corners are mitered and glued, and I'll attach it with some brads. Now this final piece is a piece of 1x2 mitered on the corners, and I allow it to overhang that cove by about a ½ inch, which gives it another shadow line, completing the top of the cabinet. I've just drilled a hole with a bit specifically used with these hinges that creates that recess for the cup of the hinge. The center line of these surface-mounted pieces of the hinge align with the holes that I just drilled in the doors. The bifold door pivots on these European-style hinges. Same holes as I used on the outer hinges, and I really like these because these cups act like a mortise and give a lot of strength to the hinge door connection. Another benefit to this type of hinge is that they can be removed and installed without any screws. They simply snap into place. You have to get them aligned. That one snaps in. Get these two line up. Snap it in, and that's it. And then they will snap into the closed position. Well, that takes care of the woodworking and the initial steps with the hardware. Before I go any further, I think I'll take it into the paint room and give it a nice coat of paint. And here they are, after a trip through the paint shop, where I applied a coat of primer to all the raw poplar first, then 2 coats of a high-quality enamel to give it a nice, durable finish. I've installed the glass panels in the doors. They're held in place with these square stops and some pin nails. No knobs or handles. I wanted a nice, clean look. So I have these touch catches which hold the door closed, and then when I want to open it, it pops it out, and I can swing it open. And you've got to love this bifold door. Next to it, the tall case, and you can see how it flows right up through that cornice. Blink and you think you're looking at slabs of marble. So if you happen to know anyone who has a Greek temple in need of bookcases, you have a plan. Now let me show you what we're going to build next time. Next time we'll build a different kind of temple, a storage shed, a place for your garden tools, your lawn furniture, and even your snowblower. The goal was to build something that would be simple to construct, easy on the pocketbook, and easy to maintain, yet still be attractive. We'll show you how to build one next time, right here in the New Yankee Workshop.
If you've enjoyed this New Yankee project, you may want to try some of the others. There are projects meant for the workshop, the garden, the kitchen, and many more. So whether you're a fan of Shaker style, or colonial, arts and crafts, or Chippendale, there may be a Norm project you'd like to build. Whether it's a clock or a gazebo, a picnic bench or a Windsor chair, a child's toy or a sailboat, visit the New Yankee website at www.newyankee.com for a complete listing.